This corner cabinet, CNC mortise and tenon, dominoes, biscuits, pocket screws, wood buttons. So I used a lot of techniques to build this cabinet, but this is just one way to do it. My goal was to create a freestanding piece of fine furniture that would last for generations. Now, I haven't made a lot of fine furniture, and this is my first foray really into it. Now, I have made a lot of cabinetry, but for all that, I've used veneered plywood, which basically allows you to ignore wood movement. And for this particular project, I wanted to challenge myself and use solid wood. So I designed this project in Fusion 360. I'll share the file in case you want to try and make it. Link will be in the description as a free download. And I iterated on the design a lot, so there are a lot of options that I did in the file. Earlier, you saw me prepping the stock for this vertical style. I drew the basic shape on the piece to kind of give me a guide, and then I set the angles on my table saw and used it to rip them out. To do it safely, once I had one piece ripped, I used the offcut and just double-side taped it back onto the piece so I could hold it securely and do the other cuts. Of course, having a nice feather board like this 3D printed one made it really a lot safer to do. All my other face frame pieces are pretty simplistic, and I just milled them to 3/4 of an inch thick, rip them to the proper dimension, let them sit actually a little bit, and then rip them to the final dimension, and then cross cut them. The part where it starts to get interesting is cutting out the joinery. Now if we think about it, you want the front face to all be aligned, and so that's my reference face, and I have that reference face, the front face, always be against my vertical work table, and this way everything will be relative to the same face and should line up correctly. I use my 3D printed toe clamps to hold the workpiece down, and I just use a parallel to get it to the right height so it sticks above the table. The parallel is 1 inch and 1/8, and my tenon is going to be 1 inch long. I start with a full depth pass to score the outside and help prevent chip out on the parts that you would see, and then I come back and cut the rest of the tenon. My panels have a groove in them, and so I have to mount them horizontally. I made a quick jig to mount them securely, and then I can cut the slot in them. This is another 2D pocket operation in Fusion 360, and in general, doing a pocket with a 1/4 inch bit that's a 1/4 inch wide won't work, but if you set the stock to leave to be like -1/1000th of an inch, it will actually let you do it. Clamping the longer stiles was a bit trickier. I used my 3D printed clamps on the edges, but the piece bowed out a bit in the middle, so I had to get creative and clamp it with some other hold down methods. If any of you guys have a better idea on how to do this, let me know. I then used the CNC to cut them mortises, and the thing about the mortises is that you want them to fit well with the tenons, so I use a radial stock to leave of about -0.005 of an inch, -0.005, to give them a good fit. And you also want to have the axial stock to be a little bit deeper, and that way your tenons won't bottom out. Those triangle shaped stiles I cut earlier on the table saw, I cleaned up the marks a little bit with a hand plane, and then I used the double-sided tape trick again with the offcut to get them so I could mount them on my CNC table, and I cut the mortises out on those guys too. My door panel handle was cut out on the CNC machine. I used a 1/4 inch bit for roughing it out, and then a 1/4 inch ball nose bit for doing the finishing passes. So at this point the face frame was fitting together pretty well with the mortise and tenons, and it's time to make the center panels. My center panels are 1/4 inch thick maple, and so I took a piece of 4/4 inch maple that was slightly warped, and I find I can get more material out of it if I face on the CNC than when I use the joiner. I can then take it over to my bandsaw and rip it in half, clean it up a bit, and glue them together. I have one large center panel for my door and two smaller ones for the side. I mount them on my CNC table with my toe clamps backwards to kind of hold it down, the thin piece. And then I cut out the 1/4 inch grooves down to I think 1/16 of an inch in depth. I covered up the grooves with some blue tape and put one coat of finish on them. That way, if any wood movement happened, you wouldn't see any unfinished areas in my panel. For my glue up of the panels, I did a lot of dry fitting to make sure everything would go together, and this really helped me a lot because I would always have glue up problems. Doing a dry fit really helps solve any problems. I put glue only on the tenons, and the center panel is going to float completely. I did use some silicone spacers, just a little bit of dried silicone sealant, and that helps space it a little bit and allows it to still expand. For the slats in the door, I planed some wood down to a little bit thicker than 1/4 inch of a thickness so I could kind of sneak up on the size. I mounted a bearing on a piece of scrap wood and put it in my table saw T-slot and used that as a marker to rip the thin strips. I ripped them a little bit wider than 1/4 inch again so I could sneak them up to the final size. I recently got a drum sander, and it's been pretty handy to sneak up on the final sizes for things like this and to get them to fit just right into the grooves. I started with them a little bit longer than they needed to be and trimmed them all to fit and then marked where they needed to be. I could flip them over and apply some glue on the back side all at the same time. I used some pencil marks to tell me which side was the back in case I flipped them, and when I was gluing them up, I did accidentally flip one to the side, had to wipe the glue off and re-glue it and put it back in. One of the things I spent a bunch of time was figuring out how to clamp these. They are about 1/16 of an inch below than the surface of the actual face frames, so I had to kind of get creative to clamp them in tightly. Not using plywood meant I had to spend a lot of time gluing up all these panels for the sides, the bottom, the shelf, and the top. I started using some of these saddle clamp jigs to hold my clamps and make my glue ups a lot straighter. I designed and printed my own unique style for these clamps, and I'll put a link to them in the description where you can download them for free. My version is unique, but I did not come up with this style, and a guy from Felt House Family Woodworks did. I'll post a link in the description where you can buy these from them directly. I saved a lot of material by carefully laying out my boards for the top, bottom, and shelf because they have a triangle shape. I drew up my actual board widths in Fusion 360, and then I could use that as my stock base for the toolpaths. I held it down with my 3D printed toe clamps, and then I just did a profile cut around the entire piece, leaving tabs. The tabs are easy to clean up with a flush trim router bit, and then I had to figure out how to connect all this stuff together. My neighbor loaned me his Domino, and I thought I would use it to cut the floating tenons. Originally I was going to do it on the CNC machine, but the Domino is just so much faster. So I made my own floating tenons out of some maple that I had around, and I used them for attaching the front of the bottom and the sides. But attaching the sides to the front face frame was not going to work. The floating tenons just had too large of a distance to make it fit. I'll show this in a second, but my solution was just cut some biscuits because they allow a little bit more flexibility. I glued the carcass sides to the bottom piece, and also glued the front rail onto the bottom piece. After that dried, I glued the front right side on, and I'm going to show you why I use the biscuits on the left side when I glue it on. So this vertical back piece that I'm first gluing up is the piece that has the biscuits in it. Now if I didn't have a biscuit into this, I wouldn't be able to slip everything together at the weird angles that I have. The front tenons just wouldn't fit together and it just wouldn't work. The biscuits just add a little bit of alignment and strength, but not much because it's basically not any end grain. It's just side grain glued to side grain, which should be plenty strong enough. So I take my completed left side piece and I can slip it into the two tenons and pull it back enough to let the biscuits slide in and all go together. Then I can clamp it up and let it dry. The next thing I tackled was the bottom stand. I totally forgot to cut the curve on my piece, which is kind of a bummer, and I just decided to use dominoes to hold it all together since I had it. The angles didn't matter too much, and really what I was going for were clean lines on the front. Now the accent pieces on the top have a lot of fun curves, and this is perfect for the CNC. I had to cut the entire shape out, so I used double-sided tape to attach it down on my table, and like I do with a lot of other projects, I put the tape on, scrape it down really well, clamp it temporarily to my table, which really gives it good adhesion, and then I can cut it out. I used a 3/8 of an inch downcut bit to do the roughing pass, and then I came back with a 1/4 inch ball nose to do the finishing pass. Off camera, I cut a tiny groove on the inside face to just have a little bit more of an accent. And then I decided to use dominoes again to attach these accent pieces onto the top. I glued on one side, let it dry, and then I could clamp and glue on the other side, and then finally the front. There's nothing wrong with using pocket hole screws, and I use them to attach the bottom to the main carcass. And this is just a quick and easy way to attach it, and I think it's totally fine. Now my back two panels meet at a 45, and I did not glue them together. In fact, there's a 1/16 of an inch gap between them because I want to allow the wood to move. And I wanted to allow the wood to move, and so what I did for attaching them together was just use some floating tenons, cut again with a domino, and then I cut this little triangle piece out for the top and elongated some screw holes to attach it on. So there's no glue here, the tenons are cut extra wide and should accommodate any movement. Next is the 1/16 of an inch reveal gap around the door. And what I did is I cut the rails and stiles to be 1/32 of an inch larger on each side. So what this did is it made it fit in, but just be bigger than it needed to be, and allowed me to have some space to trim up the edges. I score up my doors in the table saw, and I use a crosscut blade, and I just mark on the doors where I want to remove a tiny bit. On the opposite side, I will put a shim of some blue tape, and I just put the shim on the one portion. Sometimes I'll make it a little bit longer to ensure that when I do the full rip through, it will actually not offset from the fence. And I just go back and forth, taking a tiny bit off at a time until it fits in one corner. Once it fits in one corner, I use some 1/8 of an inch shims to cut the door a little bit more on the other side until the shims fit in tightly. And then I know I'll have a 1/16 of an inch gap around the entire thing when the door is put together. I use some Blum soft close hinges for the doors, and I just marked where they needed to be and then just drilled them out on my drill press. To accommodate movement on the wood top, I decided to attach it with some wood buttons. I just used a 1/2 inch dado stack to cut a bunch of buttons out. And then for the mortises, I realized it was pretty easy to cut out those with the good old domino. I just made sure the buttons were the thickness of the domino, and this worked out pretty well. Sanding is the necessary evil part of woodworking, and I'm not going to have you watch me do a bunch of sanding. And basically I just hit it with 150 and 220, and that was it. For finishing the piece, I picked Osmo hard wax oil, and I used a matte sheen because I didn't want it to shine at all. This stuff's pretty easy to use. You just rub it on with a rag or like a white buffer and get all of it off. The white abrasive pads work really well because they give you a really smooth finish and they get off any fuzzies. I put on one coat, let it dry, and then put on a second coat. Assembly was just a matter of pushing the wood buttons into the mortises that I cut. I put them tight against the front, and then on the other parts, which might have more wood movement, I left a slight gap, like say 1/16 of an inch, and that way any wood movement would be okay. The buttons were then screwed onto the top. The Blum door hardware is super easy to install, and you can then kind of tweak the gap so you get that perfect 1/16 of an inch all the way around. All right, let's take a look at the finished piece. So here it is. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. My design is heavily influenced by George Nakashima. I also have a bit of Japanese architecture style in there. The cherry should darken up over time, and the panels, the maple panels, will look even better against it. Thanks everyone for watching. Bye.